Welcome back to Powerplay. As the pandemic continues, so does the Conservative leadership race. By August 21st, a new party leader will take the reins from Andrew Scheer. But how do you run a campaign when physical distancing measures are still in effect? And what do leadership candidates think of the government's new gun ban? Erin O'Toole opposes it. He's a Conservative MP and a leadership candidate. He joins us now from Ottawa. Sir, first of all, good to see you. Hope you and your family are doing well. Let me just start with the gun ban, and we'll get to the health crisis in a minute. They've banned 1,500 weapons. There's a 2-year amnesty. They may have legislation for a buyback. You said this in a video. You said this is politicizing the tragedy. Why do you oppose this?
Well, on the heels of a tragedy in Nova Scotia, they've made a number of claims and assertions that are quite frankly false, Evan. Having served in the military, I've actually used a military weapon, an assault weapon. There are no such thing as military or assault weapons in Canada. They have to say things like military style or assault-like weapons because they're trying to confuse people. They're trying to, after a tragedy like this, imply that law-abiding owners are somehow the problem, when statistically we know, Evan, that's actually not the case. If you want to tackle the public safety issues here, the big issue is the border. It's gotten worse in the last few years, and tragically, the weapons used in the Nova Scotia attack were illegal. And so we should never make public policy like they have. They were cutting and pasting from websites. MPs didn't have a briefing. The Parliament is not even sitting.
I get that. I think you're making a legitimate concern. Should Parliament have debated that? Absolutely. Is this effective? We don't know yet. But just on this politicizing, I'm intrigued by that. After a tragedy, shouldn't governments, I mean, if there was a nuclear accident and the government said we need new safety rules, immediately you would say that's what they have to do. Whether this is effective or not is a legitimate debate. But shouldn't a government, after the biggest mass murder in Canadian history, shouldn't the government try to address that? Why is that wrong?
Well, they shouldn't mislead people, and that's what they're doing. In fact, the Prime Minister lied at his press conference, suggesting that an AR-type rifle is used to hunt deer. That's not been the case since I was 4 years old, Evan. So this is why we have Parliament to have a debate, so that we can actually call the Prime Minister out more than just his little 15-minute appearance per day. We should be having a real debate on all issues. There should be nothing done by cabinet edict, particularly in a way. The issue with this issue is always it's rural people, Evan. It's hunters, sport shooters. They feel demonized after an attack like that, and that is both unfair, and it's not leadership. The Prime Minister, if he wants to debate these things, Parliament is for that.
Okay, but to be fair, hunters are still going to be able to hunt. There's 1,500 rifles that may or may not be effective. But here's what you wrote. I'm going to help me understand something here. In a video clip, here's what you said about this. Check this out.
Size is tragedy, something beneath the office of the Prime Minister. It's an insult to the victims and an attack on the rights and freedoms of law-abiding Canadians. It would be bad enough if the Prime Minister's plan would actually save lives, but sadly, it won't.
Sir, you said it would be bad enough if this plan actually saved lives. To be candid, I don't understand what that means. If his plan saves lives, you're still against it? What's wrong with it? It just seems to me you're against a plan that might even save lives. That means you seem to be opposed no matter what.
Well, that's the Liberal spin, Evan. The politicization of a tragedy.
To be fair, those are your words, sir.
My words said it's wrong. It's beneath the office of a Prime Minister to politicize tragedy. That is exactly what's been done here, 100%. You know, when there's military incidents and tragic crashes we saw last week, the first thing I don't try and turn that into military spending questions, Evan. There's a tragedy and emotion related to it. I served in Nova Scotia. My family's in Nova Scotia. Everyone's raw from it. Parliament's not even sitting. And so in a misleading display of incompetence by Minister Blair and the Prime Minister, they actually lie or tell falsehoods in the middle of the presentation. And millions of Canadians are left feeling like they are a public safety risk when statistically, Evan, we know they're not. So let's have a real debate on these issues. And people, in fact, the Prime Minister might learn a lot himself.
To be fair, you said even if this saved lives, it would be bad enough. But let me go to the, because you want to run to the leader, you're running against a guy named Derek Sloan. Derek Sloan is he's been on this program, he's a social conservative, and he questioned the allegiance of Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam. He said, does she work for Canada or does she work for China? I didn't hear you condemn that. Is that out of line? Would you condemn that statement and demand an apology for that?
Well, you didn't hear it, Evan, and that's curious because I actually said to the reporter, you should not impugn the motives of any public official, even if you're frustrated. So that's where he crossed the line. His concerns about the WHO and its influence from China, Evan, I asked the Prime Minister about this 2 years ago, and he gave a ridiculous answer about swaggering on the world stage because he's been asleep when it comes to China. But in terms of Dr. Tam, I have some serious concerns with the initial response of this crisis. I've talked about it. You don't need to impugn someone's motives, but we certainly have to learn from the mishandling of this crisis by the Liberal government. In fact, I was being mocked, Evan, for using the terms like war footing, we needed to prepare at the early part of March. And the Liberals were still saying we didn't even need to restrict flights from China. So they made the crisis worse. At an appropriate time, we'll do a deep dive. I've been trying to work with them on a number of initiatives, but it is fair to criticize everyone. But I hold Minister Hajdu and Prime Minister Trudeau responsible, no officials.
Okay, do you trust the information coming out of the WHO, an organization you've called incompetent before? The U.S., by the way, I just want people to know, the U.S. is by far the biggest contributor. China is the second biggest contributor to the UN in general. China's way down the list. Even Canada's ahead of them. Do you trust information now coming from the WHO, sir?
No, not as a rule of thumb, I don't, Evan. I've had concerns because if you look at my question from 2 years ago, China was using its influence to exclude Taiwan from pandemic planning. In fact, I mentioned the fact that Taiwan, the Toronto area of Canada, were all involved in the SARS pandemic 15, 17 years ago. And China was using its political influence to manipulate a body that was supposed to be pandemic planning. There's been slow reporting. Erwin Kotler's report that he cites suggests 95% of global cases could have been avoided if the WHO and Communist Party of China had been more transparent. So do I trust as a rule of thumb everything that comes out? No. Should there be international coordination of an effort to prevent a pandemic? Yes. So the UN should be reformed and improved. And this is where Canada should be pushing for reform, not for a Security Council seat where we have to turn a blind eye to actions like Chinese influence at the WHO.
Just real quick, last question. Would you, if you were the Prime Minister, would you stop funding to the WHO right now, like the U.S. has done?
No, certainly not in the middle of a pandemic. But actually, Evan, when I ran 3 years ago for leader, I said we should start holding back dues from certain agencies of the UN to force reform. Evan, I've met peacekeepers that have more operational stress injuries from peacekeeping and flawed UN peacekeeping. We see Rwanda. We've seen manipulation of agencies from ICAO to the WHO. We shouldn't be satisfied when a multilateral body is gamed by some of the bad actors of the world. It's up to the good actors of the world, like Canada, to push it to be better.
All right, I got to leave it there. Good to have you back on the program, sir. Appreciate it. Thanks, Erin O'Toole.
Good to be back.
All right, that is Erin O'Toole. He's running, one of the four, running to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. Coming back up, it's Back to Work.